Della Marsh buried her husband Abel in April. By law, his brother Harmon took the farm, the stock, the house, and he left her the one thing no one else wanted: 12 beehives, roped to a wagon. She did not weep at the reading. She counted the hives. 60 miles across Reigate Valley, 40 gates stayed shut. "Get that stinging plague off my land," a cattleman spat, and his hired hands laughed against the fence. He was the 40th man to wave her off. Not one of the 40 asked what the bees were for. One man did. An orchard that had not borne a single bushel in 6 years. He read a question in a farm paper, and he opened his gate. If you believe love is built with 2 pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go any further, do one thing for me: subscribe, so a story like this one can find you again. And comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. Let me take you back. It was the spring of 1889. Washington had not yet been a state a full year. Reigate Valley sat east of the mountains, dry and bright, a long, shallow bowl of wheat ground and cattle range, and here and there, an orchard that some hopeful man had planted and prayed over. The snowmelt ran cold in the creeks, the wind smelled of sage and turned earth, and in a small parlor in the town of Reigate, a widow sat with her hands folded while a lawyer read her out of her own home. His name was Mr. Coyle. He wore spectacles and a black coat, and he did not look at her when he read. He looked at the paper. Abel Marsh had died without a will. Della knew what that meant before Coyle said it, but Coyle said it anyway, slow, as though she were a child. When a man dies and leaves no words behind, the law speaks for him, and the law in the territory had no soft place in it for a wife with no son. The land Abel had broken with his own hands went to his brother. The house went to his brother. The plow, the 2 mules, the milk cow, the standing crop in the ground, all of it to Harmon Marsh. Harmon sat across the parlor in his good hat, turning it slow between his knees. "There is the matter of the bees," Coyle said. Della lifted her chin. "The apiary," Coyle went on, reading, "being the personal enterprise of the late Abel Marsh's wife, and of no clear value to the estate, is set aside to the widow. 12 hives, such tools and frames as pertain to them. He said it the way you'd hand a woman a broken cup. Here, you may keep this. No one else wants it." Harmon almost smiled. He caught himself, but she saw it. He thought he had won everything and given up nothing. He thought the bees were a nuisance she'd be glad to be rid of within the year. Della said, "Thank you, Mr. Coyle." Her voice did not shake. She had practiced not letting it shake. She did not tell them what she knew. That was her first lesson, learned young and learned hard. You do not lay your best card face up on a table full of men. Let them think you've been left with nothing. Let them feel a little sorry for you. A woman they pity is a woman they stop watching. That afternoon she went out to the hives alone. Abel had built them well. 12 Langstroth boxes, painted white years back, the paint gone chalky now, the wood silvered at the corners. She knew every one. She knew which queen was old and which was strong, which colony ran hot and which was gentle enough to work barehanded on a warm morning. Abel had taught her the frames when they were first married, and then, as the years went on and the knees and the eyes go on a man, he had taught her everything. And then, she had passed him, and he had let her. That was the truth she carried and told no one. The bees were hers. They had always been hers. She had a wagon, an old one, and a horse named June that Harmon had overlooked because June was lame in one hind foot and worth little to a cattleman. Della didn't need a fast horse. She needed a patient one. She worked 2 days lashing the hives to the wagon bed. You cannot simply pile bees like cordwood. You close them at dusk when the foragers are home. You block the entrances with cloth so they can breathe but cannot pour out. You rope each box so it cannot shift, because a hive that tips on a rough road becomes a war. She did it all herself, in the last light, her hands sure, the low hum of 40,000 wings under her palms like a sound the ground itself was making. 12 hives. She counted them again when they were tied. She had counted them at the reading, and she counted them now. Counting was how she kept her hands from shaking. Before she climbed up to the seat, she did one more thing. She had 2 pieces of paper. The first was a clipping, folded small and soft from handling, cut from a farm paper out of Walla Walla. It carried an article by a man who kept orchards, and it said a thing most men in the valley had never heard and would not have believed. It said that fruit trees do not set fruit by weather and prayer alone. It said the blossom must be carried, pollen from tree to tree, and that the surest carriers on God's earth were honeybees, and that an orchard set among hives would bear where an orchard alone would fail. She had read it 11 times. She knew it the way she knew the 23rd Psalm. The second paper was blank. It was a clerk's form, the kind you file at the county courthouse to make a thing legal and lasting. She had bought it for a nickel. It had no words on it yet. But it would. She tucked both papers under the wagon seat, flat, out of the wind. "A promise you can't file isn't a promise," she said. She said it to June, or to Abel, or to no one. It's just a kindness. And kindness runs out. Then she clucked to the horse, and the wagon groaned, and Della Marsh drove out of the only place she had ever been a wife, with everything she owned humming behind her in 12 white boxes. She was not looking for rescue. Understand that about her, because the valley never did. She knew to the penny what she had. She had a working apiary and a head full of a science not one man in 100 miles had bothered to learn. She did not need a roof handed to her. She needed ground for her hives and a share set down in writing. That was all. That was everything. But you cannot set hives on air. You need land, and land in Reigate Valley belonged to men, and men have gates. The first gate she came to belonged to a wheat farmer named Kellerman. He came out to the fence in his shirt sleeves and heard her out. He was not a cruel man. That was almost the worst of it. He listened, and he even nodded, and then he looked past her shoulder at the 12 white boxes on the wagon, and his face closed like a hand. "Bees," he said. 12 strong colonies, Della said. "I'd want to site them at the edge of your ground, well off the house. You'd not know they were there, but for the honey I'd bring you." "My boy got stung 2 summers back," Kellerman said. "Swole up like a bread loaf. My wife not sleep a night with them things on the place." He shook his head, already turning. "Honey's fine. I got no quarrel with honey. But I'll buy that in town, ma'am, and not lie awake for it." He thought she was selling honey. He heard the word bees and thought sting, thought pain, thought the small red welt on a child's arm. He did not think of his wheat. It never once crossed the man's mind that a bee is worth 100 times more in the air over a field than it is in a jar. Why would it? No one had ever told him. He saw a nuisance and a luxury, and he sent her down the road. She thanked him. She always thanked them. She drove on. The second gate stayed in her mind longer, because the second gate was a woman's. Her name was Mrs. Alcott, a widow herself, older, with a good small place she ran with a hired man. Della had thought, foolishly, that a widow might understand a widow. She thought wrong. Mrs. Alcott did not even speak of the bees. "You're traveling alone," the old woman said. She stood on her porch and did not come down the steps. A woman, on a wagon, going farm to farm, gate to gate, asking men for ground. "I'm asking for a fair arrangement," Della said. "Written and filed, not charity." "It's not the arrangement they'll talk about," Mrs. Alcott said. "It's you on the seat of that wagon with your hair coming down, knocking at men's fences with the sun going. Do you know what they say about a woman who does that? Do you know what they'll say about me if I take you in?" She folded her arms. "I have a name in this valley. I kept it clean 40 years. I'll not spend it on a stranger's bees." So, it was not the sting that time. It was the talk. It was what people say. The old woman was more afraid of the valley's mouth than of anything with wings. And Della understood then that she was not fighting one fear, but a whole weather of them, and that the fears did not even agree with one another, and that every single one of them ended the same way. With a gate not opening, she camped that night by a creek and ate cold biscuit and did the arithmetic in her head to keep steady. 12 hives. Each strong colony might throw 60-80 pounds of surplus honey in a good year. Honey at what it fetched in town. Wax on top of that, and wax was cash money, always for candles and salve and polish. And under it all, unseen, the real gold, the thing none of them would pay for because none of them could see it. Pollination, an orchard turned from barren to bearing. She could not sell what a man refused to know he needed, but she could find the one man who needed it enough to learn. She counted 40 gates over the days that followed. I will not walk you through all 40. The valley would have you believe there were only ever 3, because 3 is all it likes to remember. But there were 40, and 39 of them were some flavor of the first 2. Fear of the sting. Fear of the talk. A few just laughed. A few were kind and useless, like Kellerman. A few shut the gate before she finished her first sentence. She kept a tally in the back of her mind, not out of bitterness, but the way a sailor counts miles. 40 men had looked at her wagon and seen a plague, or a scandal, or a joke. Not one of them, not a single one, had asked her what the bees were for. The 40th gate belonged to Royce Tandy. She had heard his name before she saw his land. Everyone in the valley had. Tandy ran the biggest cattle outfit on the East Range, and he ran it loud. His fences were new, and his hands were many, and he had the particular meanness of a man who has done well and mistaken his luck for wisdom. He was leaning on his own gate when she came up the lane, and 3 of his hired men were with him, and she knew from the set of his shoulders that he had already decided to enjoy this. Well, he said, before she'd even stopped the wagon. Look what's come calling. The bee woman. He said it the way you'd name a smell. Mr. Tandy. She kept June standing. I keep an apiary. 12 colonies. I'm looking to cite them, and I pay my way with honey and a share put down in writing. Tandy was already grinning at his men. One of them snorted. Get that stinging plague off my land, Tandy said. Loud, for the audience. I got 400 head that spook at a horsefly. You think I want a wagon load of them things buzzing my range? Woman, I wouldn't take your bees if you paid me to. And his hands laughed, all 3 of them, easy and cruel, the way men laugh when the boss has told them it's safe to. Della sat very still. She looked at Royce Tandy, and she saw all of it clear. He had range, but no orchard. He would never in his life need what she carried. Arguing pollination to a cattleman was arguing color to a blind horse. So she did not argue. She turned June's head, slow, and as she came about she said, in a voice pitched only just loud enough to reach them, 40 men have looked at my wagon and seen a nuisance. Not one has asked what the bees are for. Tandy heard it. She saw it land. For half a second the grin flickered, because a man like that can always feel when he's been told, even if he can't say how. Then he covered it with a bark of a laugh, and she was already driving, and the laughter followed her down the lane like a dog that couldn't quite catch the wheel. She should have driven straight out of the valley then. She had one gate left to try, at the poor end where the good ground gave out, and she meant to try it in the morning. But she needed flour and a few nails, and June needed a shoe looked at, and so she came into the town of Ryagate the next forenoon and pulled up at the feed store, and that was where the valley made its spectacle. Tandy was there. Of course he was. Half the valley's men passed through that store on a Saturday, and the story of the bee woman had gone ahead of her, the way a good joke does, and Tandy had a crowd and an itch to perform. There she is. He called out as she climbed down. The bee woman herself. Hey, everybody, mind your ankles. She's got a wagon full of the devil's own cavalry." Men chuckled on the store porch. A couple of women drew their skirts and their children back without quite knowing why. "Tell him, honey," Tandy said, coming down off the porch, thumbs in his belt. "Tell him how you're going to get rich off a wagon full of stingers. Tell him how 40 grown men were too foolish to want your bugs." "Mr. Tandy," Della said, very level. "I've business inside. Let me buy." "Let her buy," he mocked, stepping closer, playing to the porch. "She's got business. Important bee business." And he reached out, not to strike her, he wasn't that, but worse in a way, careless. He reached out and gave the nearest hive box a shove with the flat of his hand, the way you'd cuff a dog off a chair, just to make her flinch, just for the crowd. The box shifted. The rope had loosened on the rough road, and she had meant to relash it. The lid tipped. And 40,000 bees that had been rattled 60 miles and jostled and shoved came up out of that box in one dark, rising breath, and the sound of it changed the whole street. The porch emptied. Men who had been laughing a second before went off that porch like the boards were afire, hats flying, one of them straight through the store's open door and into the flour barrels. A woman screamed. A horse at the rail reared and broke its tie. Tandy himself went backward over his own boots and sat down hard in the road, swatting at the air, roaring, and the crowd that had come to laugh at Della Marsh scattered from her in every direction like water off a hot stove. And Della did not run. She stepped in. Toward the hive, not away from it. She had left her veil in the wagon box, and there was no time for it, so she took the stings. She took them on her hands and her wrists, and one on the cheek below her eye, and each one was a small white star of pain, and she did not make a sound. She righted the box. She lowered her voice to the hum, the way Abel had taught her, slow hands, no fear, because a bee reads fear in the air like a word on a page. She got the lid seated. She drew the loose rope tight and lashed it down, 2 hitches, hard, the way it should have been all along, and by the time Royce Tandy had gotten himself up out of the dirt and behind the water trough, the colony was closing again, the roar sinking back to a hum, the last few foragers circling down home. The street was dead quiet. Every soul that hadn't fled was staring at her. Her cheek was already swelling. One eye had begun to close. She did not touch it. She turned and looked at the crowd, at the faces in the store windows, at Tandy wet and furious behind his trough, and she did not cry. And she did not shout. And she did not explain. She simply climbed back up onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins in her stung and swelling hands, and clucked to June. The wagon rolled the length of the main street at a walk. Nobody said a word. She passed the church and the bank and the last house at the edge of town, and she kept on past it, out to where the ground got poor and the fences got mean and the valley seemed to give up on itself. She let the tears come then, but only then, only where no one could bank a thing on them, and she wiped them off before they were half dry. 40 gates. She'd have said 41. Now, if you counted the town itself slamming shut on her in broad daylight. But the town wasn't a gate. The town was just the fear made loud. There was one gate left. She came to it in the last of the light, and she almost drove past it, because it did not look like much. A sagging rail gate on a leather hinge, the latch hanging crooked so it wouldn't seat. A hand-lettered board gone gray. Beyond it, up a rutted lane, stood a house that needed paint and a barn that needed more. And behind the house, running up the slope in tidy rows that somebody had cared for once, and cared for still, stood an orchard. She stopped the wagon and looked at it a long moment in the low gold light, and something in her chest went tight and careful, the way it does when you finally see the thing you've been driving toward and are afraid to believe it. The trees were beautiful. That was the strange part. They were not sickly. They were full-grown and full-canopied, well-pruned, the ground beneath them clean, and every branch was heavy with blossom, white and pink, so thick the whole slope glowed with it, and the evening was sweet with the smell. It was the finest-looking orchard she had seen in the whole valley. It looked like an orchard that ought to break its own limbs with fruit. A man came down the lane toward the gate. He was youngish, lean in a way that wasn't natural leanness, but the kind a man gets when the flower's being stretched, and there was flower dust, or maybe just tiredness gray in the lines of his face. He walked like a man who'd been up since before the sun, and would be up after it set. He stopped on the far side of the sagging gate, and looked at her, and looked at the 12 white boxes, and his face did not close. His face opened. "Ma'am," he said. "You'll be the woman with the bees. I'll be her," Della said. "Word came up the valley ahead of you." He glanced at her swelling cheek, at the stung eye, and something moved in him, but he had the grace not to name it. "I'm Jonah Reeve. This is my place, such as it is." He looked back up at his own beautiful, blooming, empty orchard, and when he spoke again, his voice had a crack of something old and worn thin in it. "You see that? Finest bloom in 3 counties. Every spring like this, white as a bride. And come fall," he stopped. "6 years I've had this orchard. 6 springs it's bloomed just like that. And in 6 years it has not given me 1 bushel of fruit to sell. Not one." Della felt her own pulse in the stings on her hands. The blossoms open. Jonah went on, half to himself, the way a man does when he's said a thing over in his own head 1,000 nights. They open and they smell like heaven, and then in a week they just drop. The ground goes white with them, every petal down in the dirt and not a fruit set behind it. I've limed. I've watered. I've prayed over these trees till my knees gave out. The bank's got a note on this ground, and the note comes due in the fall, and I cannot for the life of me understand what I'm doing wrong when the trees look like that. He turned back to her, and he made himself smile, tired. "But you didn't come to hear a man's troubles. You're looking to sell honey, I expect." "I've not got much money, but, Mr. Reeve," Della said, "I'm not here to sell you honey." She climbed down off the wagon. Her hands hurt and her eye was near shut, but her voice, when it came, was the surest thing in the valley. "Your trees blossom and drop," she said, "every spring, and you think it's the weather, or the soil, or something you did wrong. It isn't any of those. Your trees can't set fruit because there's no one carrying the pollen from bloom to bloom. A fruit tree can't do it on its own, and the wind won't do it for you. It needs a carrier. Bee to blossom, blossom to blossom, tree to tree." She turned and laid her stung hand flat against the nearest white box, gentle, and the low hum came up through the wood into her palm. "That's not weather, Mr. Reeve. That's not luck. That's what I've got roped to this wagon. That's the exact thing your orchard has been starving for 6 years." Jonah Reeve stood very still on his side of the crooked gate. She watched it move across his face, disbelief first, and then the memory of something read somewhere, and then a kind of terrible dawning hope that hurt him worse than the doubt had, because hope is the expensive one. "I read a piece," he said slowly, "in the Walla Walla paper. Fellow said orchards did better near beehives. I thought it was." He swallowed. "I thought it was a notion." "I didn't. It's not a notion," Della said. "I've got the same clipping under my seat. I've read it 11 times, and I knew it was true before I ever read it, because my husband and I kept bees beside a neighbor's apple ground, and that ground bore like a miracle, and everyone but us thought it was the man's good luck." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The bees hummed. The blossom smell hung thick and sweet between them in the dark. And here is where the valley would have you believe the widow wept with gratitude and begged this good man for shelter, and he took her in out of Christian mercy, and wasn't that lovely? That is not what happened. Because Della Marsh had not crossed 40 gates to be taken in. "So here are my terms," she said. And she reached back into the wagon and drew out the folded clipping, and under it, the blank clerk's form, and she held them so he could see them both in the last light. I'm not asking for a room. I'm not asking for your charity, and I'm surely not asking for your name. I'll set my 12 hives among your rows, sited and spaced the way they need to be, and I'll work them, and your trees will set fruit this very year. I've no doubt of it, and in return I want a share. Set down in writing, filed with the county clerk in town, with your signature and mine both on it, recorded, legal, and lasting. Jonah blinked. A share of the honey, you mean? That's fair. That's more than 1/3 of the honey crop, Della said. 1/4 of the orchard's increase over what it bore last year, which was nothing, so 1/4 of everything it bears. And the wax is mine to render and sell besides. Written, filed in the record book at the courthouse, where any man in this valley can go and read it. He stared at her. Filed, he said. Why filed? My word's good. I'd shake on it right now, because a handshake isn't a share, Mr. Reeve, it's a kindness. She held his eyes. And I have learned the hard way what the law does to a woman who's been given a kindness instead of a right. My husband died, and his word died with him, and the law handed everything we built to a man who never worked a day of it, and it left me 12 boxes of bees because those weren't worth the ink to argue over. I will not build another thing on another man's good intentions. A partner who owns her share on paper can't be waved off down the road come autumn, after the trees are heavy, and the note's been cleared, and a man decides he doesn't need her anymore. She set the 2 papers on the top rail of the sagging gate, between them, blank form and worn clipping side by side. That's the offer. Ground for my hives, fruit for your trees, and my name in the county book. Take it or send me down the road like the other 40. The blossoms stirred on the trees. Somewhere up the dark rows, a late bee droned home. Jonah Reeve looked down at the blank form on the rail of his own broken gate, and then up the slope at 6 years of beautiful, barren, blooming trees, and then at the swollen, stung, unbending face of the woman who had just told him, plainly, that she was worth more than his gratitude. He reached out. Not for her, for the gate. He lifted the crooked latch with his thumb, and it hung wrong, and it would not seat, so he simply swung the whole sagging thing wide on its leather hinge until it stood open to the lane and the orchard, and the last light. Bring your wagon up, Jonah Reeves said, and his voice was rough. We'll want a lamp and a level table to write on. If you're going to put your name in that book, he stopped, and made himself say it right. If we're going to put our names in that book, I want it read out fair. Every word, before either of us signs a thing. Della Marsh stood there in the dark with her heart going hard, and did not let it show, and picked her 2 papers back up off the rail. His was the only gate that opened. But a gate is not a contract, and an open hand at dusk is not the same as ink dried in a county book. There was a lamp to light, and a table to find, and words to be read out fair, every one, and there was a thing Jonah Reeve had not told her, a number and a date in the fall, that he swallowed back down even as he swung the gate wide. She did not know it yet. Neither did she know that 40 gates behind her, in a wet street, Royce Tandy was already telling the story his own way. She only knew the gate stood open, and the trees were white, and somewhere in that dark orchard her whole life was about to be written down. She led June up the lane, and behind her, unlatched, the crooked gate swung slow in the evening wind, and would not quite close. The lamp took 3 tries to catch. Jonah's hands were not steady, and neither were hers, though for different reasons. He cleared the kitchen table with his forearm. A tin plate, a whetstone, a coil of wire, all of it swept to one end. Then he set the lamp down and turned up the wick until the room went gold. Della laid her 2 papers flat. The clipping from the Walla Walla farm sheet, soft at the folds now, and the blank clerk's form, stiff and official, waiting. "Read it out," she said. "You said fair, so read it." He did. He read the printed lines first, slow, his finger under each word like a man who did not fully trust his own eyes. County of. Territory of. This agreement between. Then he stopped where the blanks began, and he looked up. "You want your name here. I want my name first." He wrote it. Della Marsh. The pen scratched. Then, his own below hers, Jonah Reeve, and the ink sat wet and black in the lamplight. They set down the terms one at a time. 1/3 of the honey crop to her, kept or sold as she saw fit. 1/4 of the orchard's increase, measured at the picking, not promised at the blossom. The wax, all of it, hers to render and sell, and the hives themselves, 12 boxes, her property forever, to stay or to go on her word alone. "That last one," Jonah said. "That's a hard line to write." "It's the only line that matters," Della said. "A partner who owns her share on paper can't be sent off when the trees are heavy and the note's cleared." She said the word note without knowing what it weighed in that house. He heard it. He looked at the table. He did not tell her. He swallowed it back down, the way he had swallowed it at the gate, and he signed his name, and the thing was done but for the clerk's stamp. "Morning," he said. "We'll take it to town in the morning and have it filed." "In the morning," she said, "I set the hives." She woke before he did. The orchard was gray and wet, the blossom hanging heavy with dew, and the air held that green cold that comes just before a spring sun. She backed June down the lane herself. She would not wait for a man to lift what she had lifted 40 times already. She walked the rows first. She read the ground the way another woman reads a letter. Here the slope drained. Here the frost would pool. Here the morning light came clean over the ridge and struck the trees full. Then she set them. 12 white Langstroth boxes, one at a time off the wagon bed and onto the flat ground, each one squared to face the rising sun. She spaced them to the acre, wide, so the bees would not crowd. She pried the first lid a crack and listened. The hum came up warm from inside. 40,000 wings. Waking, Jonah came down from the house with 2 cups. He stopped at the edge of the rows and watched her work, and he did not offer to help, because he had learned already, in one night, that offering was the wrong word for this woman. "Coffee," he said instead. She took it. Black, he watched her look into the cup, then reach into her apron and break off a knuckle of comb and drop it in and stir it with the flat of a twig. "Comb honey, in black coffee." He said nothing. But he did not forget it. The bees found the blossom by full light. Della stood in the middle of the rows with her cup going cold in her hand and watched them go up into the white. They worked the flowers one at a time, patient, methodical, their legs going gold with pollen, and they carried it tree to tree the way no wind ever had and no still spring air ever could. Jonah watched too. 6 years, he said. 6 years these trees have flowered just like this, prettiest orchard in the valley and not a bushel to show. They flowered, Della said. They just had no one to carry the pollen from the one to the other. A blossom can't fruit alone. It needs the dust of another tree brought to it. That's not weather, Jonah. That's not your soil. That's what's been missing, and it's standing in 12 boxes. He was quiet a long while. Then he said, "I read that." "In the paper." "Same paper you've got folded up." He shook his head. "Read it 2 winters ago and called it a notion. A city man's notion." "It's not a notion," she said. Watch, he watched. All that week, he watched. And the blossom did a thing it had never done in 6 springs. It held. The petals that always browned and fell by the 3rd day, they held. And behind them, where the flower joined the branch, a small green swelling began, no bigger than a grain, then a pea, then the round hard knuckle of a thing that meant to become an apple. Jonah Reeve stood under a tree with his hat in his hand and did not speak for a long time. The days settled into work. Della moved among the hives in the early cool bear armed on the gentle colonies, netted on the two that ran hot. She knew each queen. She knew which box was strong and which one carried an old queen going soft, and she pulled a frame here and there to read the brood and nodded to herself and said nothing to anyone, because there was no one to say it to but him, and he was learning to listen. He fixed the gate. She came down the lane on the third morning, and the crooked thing that would not seat swung clean and true, and the latch dropped with a small good sound, and she saw the shine of fresh oil on the hinge and the new pin driven in the leather. He did not mention it, neither did she. But she noticed the way a woman notices a thing a man does when he thinks she isn't looking. She noticed other things too. She noticed that when they ate, he cut his own bread thin, that he took the smaller portion and pushed the flour toward her side, and that some evenings he did not eat at all, just took coffee and said he'd eaten in the field, though she'd been in the field beside him and knew he had not. She saw the sack of flour in the lean-to, and she saw how slow it went down, and she saw a man stretching it. So she rendered wax. More than the season needed. She had the comb from the cappings, and she had the old dark comb she'd cut out to give the colonies fresh room, and she melted it down in a kettle over a low fire and poured it into cakes, pale gold, clean, the kind that candle makers pay for and saddlers pay for and the store in town would take on the spot. She did it without a word. She set the cakes on the shelf where he'd see them. Her wax. Her share. But wax that could be turned to cash in a hard week, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it. By June the fruit was set past any doubt. The little apples hung green and multiplying, and the boughs that had stood empty for 6 years began, slowly, to bend. Jonah walked those rows in the evening like a man walking through a church. He'd reach up and turn a small apple on its stem, gentle, just to feel that it was real. "There's clover in the low field," Della said one night. "Your clover. The bees are working it same as the trees. That'll seed heavy this year. Clover seed sells." He looked at her across the lamp. "You think of everything." "I think of what things are worth," she said. "It's the only inheritance I got." They ran the arithmetic in July, at the table, by the same lamp that had witnessed the contract. Della had the figures in her head, and she laid them out plain. The honey, 12 hives, 60, maybe 80 pounds of surplus each in a fruit year. The wax. The clover seed off the low field. And the apples, a real crop, the first in 6 years, an orchard's worth. She wrote the numbers down the side of a page and drew a line and added them, and she turned the page so he could read it. Jonah Reeve read it. And his face did a thing she didn't understand. It should have been joy. It was, part of it. But under the joy there was a gray thing, a fear, and it moved behind his eyes like a fish under ice. "That's a good year," he said quietly. "That's more than a good year." Then he folded the page in half. "It'll be enough." "Enough for what?" she asked. He didn't answer. He got up and banked the fire and said good night, and she sat with the folded page and the cold cup, and she thought, "There is a thing in this house I have not been told." She learned it the last week of August. She learned it because a man in a black coat rode up the lane in the middle of the day and did not open the good gate, but sat his horse outside it and called Jonah's name. And Jonah went white to the lips before he'd even reached the fence. "Mr. Reeve," the man said. "Pruitt, Cascade Land and Loan. I'll not keep you long." He glanced past Jonah at the orchard, at the hives, at Della standing in the rows. His eyes went narrow. "I see you've company. And bees." "Well, I'll say what I came to say." The board set the fall term for the 18th of October, $840, principal and interest, due in full. "There'll be no more extensions, Mr. Reeve, 6 years is generous. The 18th, or the place goes to the bank. He touched his hat to Della, which was worse than if he hadn't, and he turned his horse and rode back down the lane. Della came out of the rows slow. $840, she said. Jonah wouldn't look at her. I borrowed against the place. 7 years back. To hold on. Then the trees quit fruiting and I couldn't pay it down, only the interest, and barely that. His jaw worked. When you came to my gate, I knew what your bees might do. I knew it might save the note. I let you sign a paper giving away 1/3 of the honey and 1/4 of the crop, and I never told you the crop had to clear a debt first. He finally looked at her, and his face was the face of a man ashamed to the bone. I let you partner into a place I might not even own by winter. The valley found its own way to make it worse. It always did. 2 days later, Mrs. Dowd came up the lane in a buggy with 2 other matrons, and she did not come for honey. She came to look. She looked at the hives, and she looked at Della's cot in the lean-to, which she made a point to see, and she looked at Jonah, and she said, in that soft, poisoned way such women have, "We'd not want anyone to talk. Mr. Reeve, a widow. On an unwed man's ground. All summer." She smiled. People do talk. She left the words there like a stain, and they did their work. Because that night Jonah Reeve stood at the table and did the thing Della had feared from the first, the thing his shame had been building toward all along. "Marry me," he said. She went still. "It solves it," he said. Fast, the words tumbling now. "It stops their talking. And whatever happens with the note, if I lose the place, you're not tied to a filed paper on ground the bank owns. You'd be my wife, provided for. Nobody could say a word against you. Let me do this right, Della. Let me make it right for you." And there it was. The rescue. Dressed up as love, offered in good faith, and wrong in every part. "If I marry you now," Della said slowly, "what happens to that contract in the county book?" He blinked. A wife doesn't need a contract with her own husband. It'd fold into the marriage. "Everything I have would be yours by law." "Everything you have," she repeated. "Which right now is a debt and a set of trees the bank means to take. And my share, the share I earned, the share I priced and signed and filed, folds into that and disappears. I stop being the partner who brought the harvest. I become the widow you took in, the woman you rescued." She shook her head, and her voice did not rise, and that was what made it terrible. "Jonah, I buried a husband in April, and the law handed everything he built to his brother, because I was only a wife. Only a wife. I will not be only a wife again. Not even to you. Especially not to you. Della, I didn't cross 40 gates," she said, "to be rescued at the 41st. She packed in the gray morning. She lashed the 12 hives back onto the wagon bed, roped tight, the way she'd hauled them all those miles, and she backed June into the traces and led her down the lane. Jonah stood at the gate he'd oiled, and he did not stop her, because there was no word he had that could stop her. And both of them knew it. The weather turned that same day. The first cold snap of the fall came down off the ridge in the night, and the morning came in white with frost on the low field, and the season tipped over toward its end. But here is the thing Jonah Reeve worked out, alone, in the cold house, with the folded page of figures open on the table in front of him. He could not sell the harvest without her. Not one bushel of it. The apples hanging heavy in his rows had come from her bees. The comb honey stacked in the lean-to was 2/3 hers by the paper in the county book. The wax was all hers. The clover seed drying in the low field was hers by 1/4. She had priced herself, and signed it, and filed it. And now the truth of that paper stood between him and every dollar the crop could bring. He could not clear the note with a harvest he did not fully own. The law that had once stripped a widow bare was, this time, on her side because she had been wise enough to write it down. He had 2 choices: marry her and erase her share, which she would never allow, and he no longer wanted, because he'd seen her face when she said only a wife. Or ride after her and do the thing he should have done at the gate. Sign as equals. Let her name stand. And bring the whole crop to town, hers and his together, as partners, and clear the debt in the open. He caught up to her wagon 8 miles down the valley road, where she'd stopped to water June at a creek. "I'm not here to rescue you," he called, before she could speak. "I'm done with that. I've got it wrong all summer and I know it." He climbed down. "Come back and finish what we signed. Not as my wife, as the name above mine in that book. Let's take the crop to town, all of it, together, and let the whole valley watch whose bees carried it." Della Marsh looked at him a long moment across the muddy road. "Whose name above whose?" "Yours," he said. "Marsh above Reeve. You brought the harvest." She turned the wagon around. They filed the paper new. Not the summer's version, tucked away in the clerk's book already, but a fresh partnership sheet, drawn clean, made plain before the town. Jonah laid it on the counter in the clerk's office at midday, with the light coming in the front window, and the clerk turned it to read it, and his eyebrows went up at the order of the names. "Marsh," the clerk read. "Above Reeve. That's how you want it entered?" "Her name first," Jonah said. "She brought the harvest." The clerk dipped his stamp and pressed it down, and Della watched the ink go dark and dry on the page, her share standing before the town in a public book. No longer a spoken thing that a man could take back, but a matter of record. She watched it dry. She had told him at the very start why it mattered. Now he'd said it himself, out loud, at a public counter, and she let herself, for one breath, feel what that was worth. Then they took the crop to Cascade Land and Loan. The 18th of October. The fall term. There was a line of farmers along the wall, hats in hand, come to pay or come to beg, and more than a few of them were faces Della knew. Faces from gates that had stayed shut, men who had waved her off and told her to get her stinging plague down the road. They watched the widow and the orchardist come in together with a ledger and a strongbox. Pruitt was at the counter. He had Jonah's file open already. He had, Della could see, the forfeit papers half drawn, because he had expected a broke man begging for another month, and he had meant to say no. "Mr. Reeve," Pruitt began. "If you've come to ask for more time, I've come to pay," Jonah said. He set it down. The ledger first, itemized in Della's neat hand apples by the bushel, sold to the packer at the depot. Comb honey by the pound, beeswax by the cake, clover seed by the sack. Real figures, buyers' names beside them, receipts folded in. And then the money itself, counted out onto the counter in front of the whole line of waiting men. $840. And more. Pruitt looked at the ledger a long time. He looked at the word bees written in it, more than once. He looked at Della, who stood with her hands folded and her chin level. And then he took up his stamp, the big one, and he pressed it to the note, and the line of farmers along the wall craned to see the word it left behind. Paid. Nobody in that room said a thing for a moment. Then one of the men along the wall, Della didn't know his name, but she knew the gate, she knew every gate, took his hat off, slow, and turned it in his hands, and looked at the 12 empty hive marks of pollen dust still gold on the widow's sleeve, and understood. The story ran ahead of them, the way stories do. At the feed store, 3 days on, Royce Tandy stood at the counter with his thumbs in his belt, the way he'd stood the day he'd made sport of her in the street and knocked her hive and sent the swarm up over a scattering crowd. He saw the talk going around. He opened his mouth, and it was plain he meant to say some version of what he'd said before. Some easy laughing thing about the plague wagon and the fool woman who hauled bees around like they were worth something. But a young hand beside him, a boy who worked the Reeve packing that fall, spoke first, not even to Tandy, just to the room. Reeve Place bore this year. First time in 6 years. Whole orchard, heavy on account of them bees. He glanced sideways. Same bees somebody ran out of this street back in the spring. Royce Tandy shut his mouth. He looked at the counter. He did not say the thing he'd come to say, and he did not say anything else either, and his silence in that store, in front of those men, was louder than any speech he'd ever made. He paid for his goods, and he left. And that was the whole of his reckoning. And it was enough. Mrs. Dowd got her answer without a word spoken to her at all. She had said people talk. And people did. But what they talked about now was a filed contract in the county book and a deed cleared free at the fall term, and a widow whose name stood first on a partnership that had saved a farm. There is no gossip that stands against a paid deed. Her whispers had nothing left to hold, and they died where whispers die, in the mouths of people who found something better to admire. And Harmon Marsh learned the shape of what he'd let go. He heard it the way everyone hears things in a valley, at church, at the store, over a fence, that the 12 hives, the ones he'd waved off at the reading as the one worthless thing not worth the wagon to haul them, had turned a barren orchard, cleared a banknote, and set the widow up as a partner with her name in the county book. The hives he had not wanted. Della never went to him. She sent him one line, later, in a letter. And it was the driest thing she ever wrote. The hives you didn't want cleared a note your farm never could. There was one gate left to open, and it was the one that had opened first. Jonah found her at dusk, at the mended orchard gate, the day the last of the crop was hauled, and the ledgers were closed, and the note was paid, and there was nothing left standing between them, but the thing neither had ever said straight out. The light was going long and gold over the rows. The trees had dropped their leaves, but the boughs still curved from the weight they'd carried. He put his hand on the latch he'd oiled back in the spring. The good latch, the one that seated true. "You could go anywhere now," he said. "You've a name that means something in this valley. You could take your hives to any orchard in the territory and write your own paper." He looked at her. "Or you could stay." Just the one word. When it came, stay, Della Marsh had crossed 40 gates that stayed shut. She had been priced at nothing and had priced herself at what she was worth. She had refused to be rescued and had made a man learn the difference between saving a woman and standing beside one. And now, at the 41st gate, the only one that had ever opened, she made her choice. She did not answer with a word. She put her hand over his, on the latch, and left it there. And the door of the house up the slope closed on lamplight, and the orchard went dark and quiet, and the frost came down soft over 12 boxes full of sleeping bees. The second spring came white. The orchard bloomed the way it had always bloomed, beautiful, but this time it hummed, loud, from end to end. The sound of 40,000 wings to a box and 12 boxes to the rose. The blossom held. The fruit would set. In the window of the house a candle burned in a cup of pale gold wax, her wax, and inside there was a table set for two, and the partnership hung framed on the wall, re-signed that winter, not for the note this time, not for rescue, but for the plain reason two people sign a thing they mean to keep. Her share stood in it, whole, her name stood first. And up the lane, that second spring, they came. Royce Tandy came first, which surprised her, hat in hand, to ask, not to make sport, not to spit about a plague, to ask whether the widow Reeve had hives to spare, because a man he knew swore bees had turned an orchard, and he had a fruit ground of his own that had never paid. Then Kellerman, the wheat man, whose boy had been stung and who had feared the sting more than he'd ever feared a bad harvest, came up the same lane on the same errand. And Mr. Dowd, the matron's own husband, quiet, embarrassed, sent ahead of his wife's talk to ask the woman that talk had tried to ruin. Della Marsh met all three at the mended gate with the painted board above it. She heard them out. And then she named her price, and she did not shave a penny off it for men who had once laughed. Full price. Cash or a share of their own increase, her quarter, measured at the picking. Filed with the county clerk, in a book, in ink, before she moved a single hive 1 foot down the road. No spoken promises, no handshakes at a fence, and no discount, she told them plain, for men who had waved her off when her wagon was full and her purse was empty. They paid it. All three. Because a nuisance you can wave off, but a thing you cannot do without, you pay for. The board over the gate was the same wood Jonah had once swung wide on a broken hinge in the last light of an April day. He'd planed it and painted it that winter, and Della had told him the order, and he'd painted it her way. Martian Reeve. Bees and Orchard. Her name first, because she had brought the harvest, and everyone who came up that lane now read it that way before they read anything else. So here is the whole of it. 40 men looked at a widow's wagon and saw a stinging plague to wave off their land. One man, at the poor end of the valley, with 6 barren years behind him and a note he couldn't pay, looked at the same wagon and, because he'd read one line in a farm paper and been humble enough at last to believe it, saw the one thing his orchard could not live without. The difference between those two ways of looking was a failed farm and a saved one. It was a widow left with nothing and a partner with her name in a book. The fastest way past 40 closed gates, it turns out, is to be carrying the very thing the 41st cannot do without. And then, this is the part the 40 never learned, to know exactly what it's worth, and to make them write it down. If you're still here at the end of this one, do me a kindness, comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled.